Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laetitia Cesari-Zarkan, and I am working on space security for the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research with a focus on cybersecurity matters. This morning, the panel moderated by my colleague, Almudena Azcarate-Ortega, focused on the space domain. And we got an amazing overview of this notion thanks to the different speakers. However, we cannot take the space domain as an individual, singular domain. It increasingly goes together with activities of all natures and from many fields, carried out on the sea, the land, and in the air. And I will also dare to add the cyber domain. The space domain is linked to the other domains in that it both depends on and enables activities within these different domains. Additionally, space is interconnected with other fields. I just mentioned cyber. We can also think of some other topics that the panelists will refer to later in the discussions. Why is it important? Because it means that there is a transformation of the strategic context. Transformation and new developments not only require flexibility, they also necessitate mutual comprehension. And as a researcher with a legal background, I am giving a great importance to definitions and context. I am using the meaning of this word, comprehension, to refer not only to the understanding of a context and effects of a situation, but also the capacity to perceive or try to perceive an intent. And this is at least my understanding of this word when I use it in my native language. This interconnection also means that there are more people involved, more types of activities to understand, and more assets to consider across the different domains and across the different fields. In any cases, this interconnection with space as part of a bigger picture will need more cooperation. Cooperation, as reminded this morning, may require mechanisms, including standards. It needs dialogue and capacity building between all of the stakeholders, state actors, and private and non-governmental organizations. Now, I will first give a brief presentation of panelists, starting with you, Dr. Beyza Unal. Dr. Unal is the head of Science and Technology Unit at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. She specializes in the interaction between emerging technology applications and their impact on international peace and security. Dr. Unal has published numerous articles on international security matters. Dr. Unal, you have the floor for introduction remarks.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. I'm going to keep the introduction remarks succinct, hopefully. You have already given, I think, a really good broad scope of the panel. I would indicate that space has always been a domain that is directly linked to other domains on Earth. And this includes not only the military domains, such as the ones that you mentioned as land, air, and maritime domains, but also to the civilian domains, that is the critical infrastructure on Earth. Let me give you a couple of examples from each cluster of domains with potential consequences to peace and security. In the military domain, I think the most important element that we need to look at is the near real-time information sharing. I'm calling it near because we are not yet there to have it completely as real-time information sharing. And the integration of that data across land, air, and maritime domains. And that in itself is very much linked to the functioning of space services. And that includes positioning, navigation, and timing capabilities, satellite-based communication systems, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, Earth observation, among others. And the functioning of all the satellites also depends on other technologies, which is something that you also referred to in your opening remarks as cyber technology. And that includes the use of software, hardware, data, and other digital components. Thus, I would say that there is this direct and indirect connections between systems and equipment across the military domain and the space technology. And the risks in the outer space domain will have implications to the military missions and operations as a result of the threats that we face. And within the civilian domain, especially when you look at the critical infrastructure level, the dependency on space services and products is also very high. And often these dependencies are unknown by the infrastructure service providers, unfortunately. And all major infrastructure sectors that you can name, the civilian nuclear infrastructure, energy, transport, food, water, health, government sector, any pick and choose basically, these major infrastructure use space-derived services for their critical functioning in varying degrees. And these sectors also have mutual dependencies to each other. Let me give you just a quick example from the energy sector. Space services are crucial for gas and oil exploration. It's crucial for power generation, transmission, and distribution of energy. We use space services for pipeline monitoring, energy trading, but also renewable energy sector. If you look at wind turbines, for instance, they're equally dependent on the PNT services, positioning, navigation, and timing services to conduct remote operations. And you can give these examples from other critical infrastructure as well. So it is really important for states to closely examine not only the existing dependencies, but also future potentials of incorporating space services and products into different critical infrastructure sectors in order to identify existing vulnerabilities and to find solutions. The bottom line, the last word from me, is that space threats can lead to cascading impacts both on Earth and in space, and thus there is the urgency for us to find common grounds at the multilateral level. Thank you, Letitia.
Thank you very much for these very interesting considerations on this topic, and you made a lot of great points that we will for sure discuss a bit later in the discussions. Now, second speaker is Eric Desautels. Eric Desautels has been serving as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges in the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau at the US Department of State. At the same time, since 2015, he has served as the Director of Office of Emerging Security Challenges. The office is responsible for missile defense issues, outer space security cooperation and engagement, emerging technology security issues, undersea cable security issues, and polar security issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, before I turn to the subject of this panel, let me very briefly mention our UN First Committee resolution. Thank you to Jessica for raising that beforehand. But the United States has put forward a draft UN First Committee resolution calling on states to commit not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests. This vote is going to occur sometime today, hopefully not now. I think probably during the reception, so if I duck out early from the reception, you'll know it's because I've gone to go see those results. But we think that protecting the outer space environment from these destructive tests is essential to allow all countries to use outer space, and we hope that countries will join us in voting in favor of this resolution. By supporting this resolution, countries can contribute their voices in order to identify this in the international community as an emerging norm of responsible behavior. Now, with that out of the way, let me turn to the actual subject of this panel and provide a few initial comments. As a starting point, as Dr. Unal mentioned, it is useful to consider that the most important role of space systems is to provide data and services to activities on the Earth that support both commercial and governmental activities. From a national security perspective, space systems can provide important early warning, intelligence, and situational awareness of terrestrial and space activities that can contribute to preventing conflict, avoid misperception and misunderstandings, and reduce tensions. But because space systems provide this important data, in conflict or potential conflict situations, states may have incentives to take away and deny this access to data. That is one of the reasons why we cannot simply focus only on the prevention of the placement of weapons in space. Preventing conflict from occurring in outer space requires a holistic view of competition and conflict between states and an understanding of how and why that competition and conflict might extend to activities conducted in outer space. One area where space intersects with other domains is in the area of arms control and strategic stability. Space-based national technical means have underpinned the verification and credibility of generations of arms control treaties. And while we have never defined what constitutes national technical means, it certainly has become synonymous with space-based systems such as remote sensing satellites. So as we think about lessons from other domains, we should consider provisions that have already been agreed to in treaties regarding interference with national technical means. A number of arms control treaties, such as the New START Treaty, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty include obligations not to interfere with national technical means. Second, as has already been mentioned, space systems are inextricably linked with the cyber domain. For example, the transmission of command and control and mission information between space vehicles and ground networks relies on the use of radio frequency dependent wireless communications channels that are vulnerable to disruption. There certainly are lessons that we should apply from the work of the group of governmental experts and on the open-ended working group on ICTs, given the overlap between space systems and cyberspace, and of course, the applicability of international humanitarian law across these and other domains. And finally, there may be lessons and ideas that we could take from existing instruments, such as the legally binding Instruments at Sea Agreement, or the non-binding Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, and the Guidelines for Aircraft Military Encounters. These maritime and air mechanisms provide guidance on how to operate in a safe manner to reduce the likelihood of interactions or encounters leading to miscalculations and misunderstandings. As we have already seen at the open-ended working group on reducing space threats, some countries have expressed interest in elaborating on what sort of behaviors demonstrate and constitute due regard, and that, as that term has been used in the Outer Space Treaty. With that, let me stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for your introduction remarks. And the third speaker will be Elina Mozorova, who is the Executive Director at the Intersputnik International Organization of Space Communications, an intergovernmental satellite telecommunication organization which brings together 26 member states. At Intersputnik, she is responsible for relations with member states and the United Nations system, including the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and the International Telecommunication Union, and manages the international and legal service. Elina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and hello everyone. It's such an honor to be here with you today. Let me share several perspectives from the position of satellite communications operators. It's exactly the business and the field of international cooperation Intersputnik is involved in. So first of all, how all these discussions related to space security and space threats impact satellite operators. Of course, it's our common interest and in the interest of SATCOM operators that their $1 million assets in space are protected. And some may say that who cares, they are insured, but even in any case when insurance cover any anomaly in space or so on and so forth, it doesn't actually cover all the expenditures of satellite operators who lose their clients, who lose their reputation. So of course, any new initiative and any existing initiative related to making space more sustainable and peaceful environment is very much supportive. You may also know that traditional geostationary satellite orbit operators have always been quite responsible, I may say. As an example, when requesting a manufacturer for building a new satellite, it is always requested that there is a number or volume of fuel for deorbiting a satellite to mitigate debris. Last year, many space operators and industry players supported what was called a space industry debris statement, just to contribute to challenging this issue. sometimes these operators follow the highest level of doing space businesses because it is specified in their national legislation. You know that many states implemented many norms, including recommendatory ones, in their national legislation, but also, and I would like to refer to the first panel, it is because sustainability did become a sexy topic like a climate change. I must say that this is a very important contribution of civil society, of academia, and from the industry, that this topic is covered in the media, it is promoted, and that it has become a standard of behavior to be responsible, either because you feel socially responsible, you have a responsibility as a corporate approach, or for purely pragmatic reasons, because you want your services to be better sold. And it is also the case that today customers may not care which exact satellite you use to provide your service, but they do care whether you have a green image or something like that. The situation is a bit different with newcomers. They may have less knowledge and expertise and usually are not confident why they should follow recommendations which provide for more expenditures on their side. For some newcomers it is unclear and what can incentivize such a behavior, but I must say that this is also a kind of a standard that every emerging space nations, for instance, which wishes to establish a satellite communication system nationally, it doesn't only request a satellite to be built, to be launched, and some assistance with regard to frequency assignments. It also asks that the knowledge is shared, that the national legal system is assisted to be developed in these countries, so it became like a package solution. And of course, the consultant services, the contractors explain what is the standard of behavior for newcomers as well. A situation is a bit different when we speak about non-GSO operators, and some concern have been expressed with regards to deployment of such large constellations, and the topic has been addressed. For instance, just recently ended plenipotentiary conference of the ITU has adopted a resolution which brought attention towards non-geostationary satellite orbit constellations, and though it was submitted by the group of states, it is believed that it is the concern expressed by the traditional satellite operators. If I briefly speak with several threats which are dealt with by satellite operators, it was already mentioned that sometimes spacecraft provide both services to the military and other governmental needs and also for civilian needs. And this can become an issue because I completely agree what Beyza has already said. It is not always clear to the service provider which service are you supporting, and it may cause difficulties indeed. You may recall that during the first May session of the open-ended working group, there was a suggestion whether military and non-military services should be divided between the spacecraft. And this suggestion received both support and sharp criticism. I do not promote any right answer to this question, but I just want to invite you to consider this because, for instance, at the ITU, for very different reasons, but there is a requirement that military and non-military radio installations are using different frequency assignments. So perhaps it is something we should also consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much for covering all of these points. And I will now give the floor to Sabrina Alam. Sabrina Alam is currently working at SES Satellites, developing, implementing, and driving the environmental, social, and governance strategy. So she knows a lot about space sustainability. And as part of this, Sabrina leads a team responsible for SES's space sustainability strategy. Sabrina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And firstly, thank you for the invite and thank you for involving private sector in such an important discussion. one thing I want to touch on is what we heard earlier about different terms being used and what it means to different people, different organizations. But actually, something that we haven't considered are the objectives and the perspective of those different players within the space industry. You know, there's this notion that the private industry wants to make money and that's the sole purpose. But actually, we don't just ignore threats to humankind. And it wouldn't make sense to from a financial perspective either. And so what we need to do is understand, what does the private sector aim to do? What do different organizations within the sector do? How can we come together and work together? Quite honestly, the majority of the time, you'll see private players work very closely with and are aligned to governmental and international organizations and their goals as well. And organizational structures and the way the space sector thrives today is only dependent on the reliance of other organizations and this kind of streamlined value chain that currently exists. And one thing I want to touch on as well is this notion of, stakeholder. We all have different perspectives of what a stakeholder means. So what does it mean to us as SES? It means our board, it means our employees, it means our senior leaders, our competitors, industry peers, governments, international organizations, customers, investors, and so on. I could talk about it for days. But this is really important to understand that everything we do from a security aspect has to make sense to all of those stakeholders as well. And when we talk about space security, we mean creating a safe environment for all to benefit from the use of space. And commercial players all strive for a secure and safe environment. And if not, how could we function as a business? How could we proceed with our business model? Again, from a financial point of view, from an insurance point of view, it was touched on earlier today, but insurers won't say, hey, I'm going to insure you if they know the risk is so great from a safety aspect. And also from a customer point of view, customer confidence point of view. And we need to work with those stakeholders, with the other industries, and with the value chain that I mentioned earlier to obtain this. And the private sector has a huge role to play through partnerships, advocacy, providing resources and pressure, and much more. But on the other hand, we do have to think about what is the objective of the private sector, and make sure that you're looking at those stakeholder groups and allowing them to also put pressure in the right ways to ensure that the business and the issues that we need to tackle are aligned with certain objectives, as I continuously mentioned throughout this talk. And something as well I wanted to touch on is this point of regulations and standards. Yes, regulation standards are great in the fact that they enable consolidation of the sector, but we need to ensure that private players are considered in these, that they are addressed, because they are the ones who actually have to then put it into practice and put it into play and do, say, the dirty work. And we also need to understand how it impacts not just existing companies, but how it would impact new space and the industry as a whole. And we need to do that to ensure it's being implemented in the right way and the most effective way. So we don't just want to throw something out there, we want to make sure we're getting what we want out of that regulation and that standard. And I'm happy to talk more in detail about that. But turning back to what security means to us, SES, as a satellite operator, provides services to numerous industries. So when we look at how we work with, say, the world, we work with the energy industry, with maritime, government, military, and so from a security aspect, we cross into many other domains. So going into cybersecurity, space sustainability, debris mitigation, military capabilities, ASAT testing, which was also mentioned as well, and climate change resilience, to name a few. And so some of the concrete actions that we do and that private sector does, or what I'm allowed to say anyways, we look at new technologies, we look at startups, we ensure we're up to date, we're abiding by regulations, and we're feeding into new and upcoming government regulations as well. We have teams working on the technical aspects, governance aspects, And, you know, this goes hand in hand with preventative measures as well. We want to be ahead of the game. We want to make sure we're creating an environment that we are aware of and that we understand how to tackle it if something does, say, go wrong. And in general, space threats have always been considered within business models and proposals. And we look at something called life cycle assessments, which is something that's new and upcoming within the industry. And that's basically looking at your product, your service, all the way from the manufacturing stage to the end of life. And some might say, wait, how does security fit in that? Well, actually, and ESG was mentioned before, space security is a huge part of ESG, and it usually sits in that risk and mitigation aspect and then report out on it. So something from a private commercial player point of view, our investors don't usually sit in the space industry. They sit across all industries. They don't say, okay, we're going to give you something completely new criteria because you're space. No, what they say is, what are you doing from an ESG standpoint? What are your general risks and how are you going to tackle them? And usually in the form of climate change, but now they're asking in the form of space safety, space regulations, and so on. So the point here is that there's a lot to be done. A lot is being done, but we need to work with our value chain, with all the stakeholders mentioned, and the fact that all of you here in a room are so from all different diverse backgrounds means we're being part of these discussions, and that's exactly the way forward. And we want to keep up to date, we want to progress, we want to be proactive, and we want to reduce those potential threats. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting perspective. And now to give the final introduction remark, I will give the floor to James Black. James Black coordinates the Defense Strategy, Policy and Capabilities Research and Wargaming portfolio at RAND Europe. He also serves as European lead for the RAND Space Enterprise Initiative, a global hub for RAND's space-related research and capability lead for the Center for Defense Economics and Acquisition. Beyond RAND, he is also a non-resident NATO 2030 fellow. James, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good that I kind of stand between all of us and the drinks reception, and that I have the unenviable task of being the last speaker on both the panel and the day. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks brief, and I'm going to try and kind of draw together some of the threads from the remarks so far, and then feed in a little bit from kind of 75 years of RAND research on space. And I think if there are going to be two themes that I particularly focus on, it's going to be the words that we've heard a lot today already around complexity and interdependency, and crucially looking a little bit about what that means for resilience or lack thereof, and for issues like cross-domain deterrence, escalation management, and strategic stability, conscious of the title of this final session. Specifically, I'm going to do so through a fairly military-centric lens, although I must emphasize that that's on purpose, and it's partly because we have a kind of overwhelmingly civilian audience here today. But that isn't to say that some of the broader kind of soft security issues, human security, environmental security, the kind of people and planet themes that I think Dr. West raised in her previous remarks in the last panel, that's not to mean that those aren't key issues as well. It's just I'm going to focus rather narrowly for my remarks. And specifically, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the issues at the operational level, and particularly focus on recent changes in kind of military doctrine and concepts, so how people understand the use and utility of military space capabilities and of space capabilities for the military. And then also look briefly at the strategic level, and particularly mention nuclear there, as it's the elephant in the room. So firstly, to kind of start with the operational level, it's worth just reminding us all that, you know, space has kind of been militarized from the very beginning. The first things that went up into space were rockets pointed at the UK. And ever since then, you know, the space and the military have clearly evolved closely together, as much as there have been strong ambitions to try and keep things, you know, peaceful uses and for the benefits of all humankind. Ambitions that are, of course, to be lauded. So today, space, you know, has long been a key enabler for joint operations in terms of SATCOM, ISR, PNT, for kind of guided weapons, all sorts of different issues. And we see an ecosystem of space actors, services and capabilities that's evolving rapidly, both on the military side and, of course, on the civilian and commercial side, as we've heard from the last couple of speakers. But it's important, I think, to remember that when we talk about military capability, we don't actually just mean technology or equipment. We also mean the kind of conceptual and the human elements. And so to briefly comment on the conceptual aspect, I'm just going to kind of give a few kind of trends that we're seeing in militaries around the world at the moment in terms of how they're thinking about space, and obviously necessarily very high level as I'm doing this in 30 seconds. I mean, I think the big trend here really is the focus on deepening integration. So moving beyond space being an enabler for other domains, but very much secondary to them, towards space being kind of on a more even footing with air, land, and sea capabilities, and of course the new domain of cyber and electromagnetic. And we see lots of kind of new jargon and buzzwords, and the military does love jargon and buzzwords. But if we look at, say, the United States, there's a lot of language about multi-domain operations or joint all-domain operations. The UK has multi-domain integration because we want it to be slightly different. There's similar language in France, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, you name it, around Europe. NATO has a concept for multi-domain operations that it's developing, and obviously space plays an important role there. And then other countries that aren't of the same kind of strategic culture have come to similar conclusions, if through their own, national kind of lens. So, Russia talks about very similar ideas in some of its military literature. China similarly talks about a kind of very systems thinking approach, with space being a key component. So we see this across the world, really, that this idea of kind of integration and entanglement of space systems and capabilities with other military domains. Now, we also see, a big role for industry and dual use, and we've had, some of that shared by our previous couple of speakers. Now, there are potential benefits from a military operational perspective to some of this, of course, or they wouldn't be doing it. But there are also challenges in terms of how we kind of manage escalation and prevent unintended kind of consequences and issues, particularly across the boundaries between different domains. And this is really where we come to that strategic level and the theme of strategic stability. So to give a few quick remarks here, and then I'll sum up. What we're seeing is a kind of growing attack surface. So from a military perspective, there are more and more things where I could be vulnerable. It's not just about the satellite, it's about the data links, it's about the ground segment, but it's also about the industry and the supply chains and the end users, all of whom are potentially, cyber vulnerabilities or kinetic vulnerabilities. But crucially, we don't necessarily understand all of that value chain and where some of those kind of vulnerabilities may lie. The second related point is then the word dependencies. So along with our vulnerabilities, we have kind of cascading dependencies. We've already heard from Beyza and some of the other speakers earlier today about the linkages between satellite and space services and then critical national infrastructure down on Earth, both military and civilian. But I want to kind of briefly kind of jump to effectively the extreme, which is to look at the kind of nuclear dimension to this. And as Eric has rightly mentioned, space has long played a key role in kind of arms control in terms of verification and in monitoring and enforcement, but also plays a wider military role, of course, in things like early warning of missile launches, command and control for nuclear systems, and then ballistic missile defense for those countries that aspire to such capabilities. And crucially, beyond the nuclear dimension, a final comment would be that this is also a dependency, not just for the military, but also for humanitarian organizations and the NGOs that are often, of course, dealing with the fallout, either figurative or literal, from military conflict. And of course, that's a huge issue for organizations like the Red Cross or others who might be trying to operate in areas where communications, for example, have been degraded and space capabilities might be absolutely essential to their humanitarian operations. So to bring this all together and conclude my remarks, the real challenge here then is the unpredictability of cascading second and third order effects from threats against space systems. So it's becoming harder and harder to predict what might happen, where you might be vulnerable, what the impact of any attack might be, and how people might respond, and how people might respond differently to others. So how I as a country might respond to a threat might be different to Sabrina or Elina or Eric or Beyza. and how all of our responses interact and how they interact across different policy levers and across different military domains is a level of complexity that many of our kind of modern systems of thinking about deterrence and escalation aren't necessarily equipped to deal with, because they were primarily developed for a bipolar Cold War era. So we really need to kind of build that transparency, the predictability, and the kind of shared understanding of norms, rules of the road, and what are acceptable behaviours and unacceptable behaviours, and of course, acceptable and unacceptable responses to those behaviours. So this is why initiatives such as the UN OEWG are so welcome, and broader efforts, I think, to build awareness, space literacy, and a kind of common lexicon, so we can have these sorts of discussions and begin to kind of peel back some of that complexity and uncertainty and build towards a more kind of shared understanding of the risks to resilience of space services and the things down on Earth that depend upon them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And I am very pleased that you are mentioning a common lexicon and the need for it, because as I mentioned during the OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group on Space Threats in September, we at UNODA with different partners and different experts are working on a space security lexicons in the official languages of the United Nations. And we hope that for the future it will be a good instrument to use for diplomatic discussions that you may have on this very topic. So I appreciate very much. And yes, so you mentioned the different layers that cannot be considered individually because of the dependency, because of the interconnection, and sometimes we can build bridges between the different fields and the different domains. And I would like to first thank you for the presentations. Your different backgrounds and your different perspectives definitely enrich the discussions and are extremely enlightening, not only for me, but also, I am sure, for policymakers, researchers, and the multiple state and non-state organizations that are following the panel here in Geneva, but also across the world via WebEx and on YouTube. So now we will enter the moderated discussion, and I will definitely abuse my moderator power by asking the first question, which is related to the parallel that I just mentioned. Can there be drawn from other security domains to space security, these parallels? Do you know of existing initiatives and steps taking place in other domains that could be applied to the issue of space security? Maybe James, you can start. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I mean we see this a lot with space, particularly when it comes to thinking about kind of space security, space warfare. Parallels are often drawn with cyber, they're drawn with maritime, they're drawn with the evolution of air power in the early 20th century, and there are certainly some lessons we can learn from successful initiatives in other domains. I think Eric gave some good examples of practical mechanisms that exist in the maritime sphere, for example. Either kind of hard or soft mechanisms that can build trust, resolve issues and incidents at sea, ensure that there are kind of lines of communication between different actors to resolve issues. I think my other remark would just be that there are also, I think, opportunities for us to learn new approaches for other domains from these discussions around space. And the reason I say that is that space is not a blank sheet of paper. We have had stuff in space for a number of decades now. But it is a relatively new domain. It is a relatively new challenge that for many of the countries that are involved in this discussion, particularly as it's moved in the last 10 years or so away from being the purview of a very, very small number of large countries towards being a global issue. And so in some ways we are kind of unencumbered by some of the kind of legacy decisions and structures that you have in other domains. Now that is a challenge because we're all clearly grappling with how you define things and so on, but I think it can also be spun as an opportunity. So if we can resolve some of these issues, I think they will cut through to other domains as well, because they'll give us an understanding of issues like how do you build trust, how do you resolve what is responsible and not responsible, how do you deal with monitoring and enforcement in ambiguous circumstances. And those are challenges that are kind of generically felt across many areas of strategic competition and international relations, not just space.
Thank you. Beyza, you have the floor.
Yeah, so just to add on the, I think, cyber point, the OEWG on space security, the second substantive session, actually looked at space threats, and one of the areas that they examined was cyber threats. And there are some parallels that I think not only the outer space community, but also the cyber community and the broader emerging tech community needs to be like learning from each other. On the cyber side, what would be the lessons learned, or what are the initiatives that are going on? So the 2015 GGE on responsible state behavior in cyberspace agreed on 11 non-binding voluntary norms. And some of these norms actually could easily apply to the space security related issues. There is, for instance, a norm on protection of critical infrastructure from ICT threats. It's the norm 13G. There is a norm on asking states to responsibly report ICT vulnerabilities and share information with each other. There is another norm, I think it was 13K, that asks not to knowingly support activities that causes harm to information systems of the computer emergency response teams, for instance. So there are many norms that states that have agreed on the cyber front back in 2015, and currently there's an OEWG on ICT security that runs until 2025 that looks at these issues, the implementation challenges, as well as to capacity building in these areas. We need to be able to, I think, find common grounds and commonalities or understandings between the different intergovernmental processes, and coordination across these processes would be really helpful, both for the outer space community, but also for the cyber community to learn from each other. Thanks, Letitia.
Thank you. Indeed, that's definitely the type of discussions that could be very inspirational. Sabrina, you have the floor, and then Eric.
Thank you. So something that I think we're all familiar with, and maybe a bit too familiar with, are emails and messaging on company laptops and so on. When we talk about space security, I think a lot of us just think about a satellite in space, but actually just on this device here, this is space security. And we mentioned cyber plays a huge role. It does. Half the time, your emails are probably confidential, and you're working with organizations on secure pieces of information that shouldn't be shared. So a practical example is something that SES is doing, where we've developed a partnership with Microsoft and Microsoft Azure, and we've implemented a number of different IT security mechanisms, which are constantly being updated. And this sounds very, very basic, but it's something this basic, which is also quite important, because if you don't have this, we'd all be kind of in trouble. And then there are other existing organizations that do work on kind of development and of IT that are looking to enter the space and satellite industry. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a very small, basic, but practical example.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to expand on the concept of why I'm excited about the parallels between the maritime and air domains and outer space. Right now in space, satellites have begun to interact in ways that ships and aircraft do here on Earth. Now, in those domains, we've had decades of experience in how to deal with those interactions. In Europe, many countries have bilateral incidents at sea agreements. In Asia, they took up an approach of doing a multilateral, non-binding code of unplanned encounters at seas that has almost the exact same language as the legally binding incidents at sea agreements that we see here in Europe. The point of these is to try to explain what is due regard, what is professional behavior, and create common understandings of how interactions should occur at sea. And it begins with things like communications. In the case of aircraft and ships, you have pilots or captains that are able to see each other. We have to figure out the challenges of two spacecraft coming together where they're not in communication with each other. They're not in any place where they may have direct communications. So that's why you frequently hear us talk about the need for communications. They also have some guidelines or legal ideas on how you should approach other vessels, ideas about not pointing weapons at other countries' vessels or aircraft that may translate into things that we could consider for our norms of responsible behavior in outer space. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Elina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just a few additions about what have already been said about cyber and aviation, which can serve an example. For instance, in 2017, there was a declaration under the auspices of ICAO regarding the cybersecurity in civil aviation, and it was declared that every cyber capability which is used in civil aviation must be used for peaceful purposes only, for security and safety reasons. And the next year, the Beijing Declaration went into force, which criminalized a number of acts which were considered by states as offenses to be prosecuted and punished. But what I would like to comment in a bit more detail is perhaps an ITU example, not directly related to security, but in a broader sense with safety. For instance, there can be an issue with regard to operator communication. It was mentioned previously that for taking measures, including for maneuvers, it is important to have almost real-time information, and generally it is dealt by operators on the working level, but sometimes due to export control rules and other restrictions, it is not easy to communicate to each other, even with regard to safety issues. Also, there are examples when operators were trying to reach out states, operators who operated, I suppose, military satellites or other sensitive satellites, and either no answer was received or information received was very much insufficient for understanding the situation, and the problem is that it is now unclear who can request what from who, and what is the level of concern which give you some ground to approach another operator or even state. I understand that there must be lots of valuable reasons and safety and sensitive data involved, but it doesn't contribute to space situational awareness at all. And for instance, within the framework of the ITU, once again for very different purpose, for technical reasons, there is a system of international monitoring agreements between the ITU and different operators, which can communicate without these restrictions and export control norms to furnish data regarding harmful interference cases, how they can be identified and how the source of harmful interference can be detected. Something similar was suggested for the auspices of the United Nations as an open platform for unified information, which information can be considered trusted, sufficient, credible, reliable. So this, of course, would be very much helpful for making space secure environment. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you also for mentioning the work at the ITU level. The ITU is the International Telecommunication Union, and they are very much active on space activities in general, including the allocation of orbits and radio frequencies. So that's also leading to my next questions. It's questions asked online by Louison Mazot from the GCSP. About UN space governance, and the question is the UN space governance structure still adapted to current multifaceted space security challenges, particularly the division between Vienna-based entities addressing space safety and sustainability and Geneva entities addressing mainly arms control and disarmament? And I am going to open the floor to anyone who is willing to answer these questions, but first perhaps I would like to hear Dr. Unal on this question.
Well, it's a really important question and a hard one that we do not have an answer yet. But really the gist of the question is, can we think about, when there's cross-fertilization of domains, and even inside one domain as outer space, can we think about a structure that outer space safety issues and outer space security issues could have a better exchange and understanding of what's happening on the space safety domain and the safety and the security domain? At the moment, unfortunately, the issues are quite siloed, as the question pointed out by the participant as well, and there are some ways to untackle that siloed perspectives. So one of the ways I think that the Secretariat has been working on the issue is really within the first committee. For instance, last week we had a discussion with a joint discussion between the first committee and the fourth committee on outer space related issues. So we had the chair of we had the two chairs coming together, as well as up from the first committee and the fourth committee, and a multi-stakeholder discussion on what are the areas that kind of cross-sects between safety and security, and how should we be thinking about these issues. It really needs states to negotiate and come up with an understanding of how to go forward, whether to hold, more joint discussions or sessions. There was a discussion, for instance, there was a point made by the co-chair last week indicating that perhaps the way forward also could be for the chairs to observe the respective work of the other groups. So if you're coming from Corpus, the Corpus chair could be able to observe what's going on in the OEWG on outer space security issues, and vice versa. So there are ways and mechanisms to go forward, but it really needs, I think, the states to discuss and negotiate and come up with proposals and resolutions to tackle the issue. And also, it's not only on outer space safety and security. I think, there could be also a way of thinking about holding joint sessions between the OEWG on space security, as well as the OEWG on ICT security, or, other emerging technology areas. We just need to realize, though, that most of the committees, the two committees, for instance, on Corpus and the outer space security issues, have different mandates and different program of work. So finding the right balance is really important in that regard. Yeah, that's what I would say, Letitia.
Thank you very much. Eric, you have the floor.
Thank you. Beyza actually mentioned the joint first and fourth committee meeting that I got to participate in as a very, many of the countries in the room actually talked about it being a unique forum for having that conversation about both sustainability and security matters. Because obviously there is overlap. There are places where the two issues come together. Our ASAT resolution is one where it is both a security issue and a sustainability issue. One of the things that we do in the United States is that we have our Department of Defense participate in both our meetings in Geneva and our meetings in Copious, because the decisions reached in Copious also apply to our military activity. So any guidelines that come up in Vienna should be applicable to all military activities. So there does need to be some interaction there, and completely agree that we need to figure out more ways to have those cross communications between the work going on in Vienna and Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's also a point that we are working on at UNODA, this intersection between safety and security matters. And we are very happy to have some exchanges on these discussions. And it leads to my next question. Does the increased integration between domains make the creation of a security-focused legal and normative framework easier or harder? Why? And if the latter, how can this be overcome? Sabrina, I will give you the floor to answer first.
Thank you. So I think we have to look at it from two sides. The first side is it could make it harder, purely because then you have less flexibility, and actually this could have knock-on effects such as actually competition problems. We as a space industry have limited buyer power. We have a set number of suppliers that we usually go to, and actually if we then have to conform to something that isn't applicable to other industries, all of a sudden other industries will say, well, hold on a second, we need to consider whether we want to continue working with you or not. If it means driving up cost, if it means X, Y, Z. I can give a practical example, and I'm going to throw out this word, or ESG again. So the EU Commission right now are trying to enforce ESG standard called the CSRD. This is great because, we get to achieve sustainability in the way we all want, but actually it's being driven by policymakers, and there's a lack of understanding of sectoral, this sectoral scheme and this sectoral idea. Now, what's happening is that we have to conform to a standard that doesn't apply to us, that we can't actually conform to. So what are the implications of that? Okay, we lose a load of money. So what will we go and do? Let's go to another country and operate there. So when you think of it from that perspective, you have to understand all the other effects that happen. You have to understand what will your suppliers do, what will your customers do, how does it increase cost, how does it drive resources, because if we have a framework, you need more people on board within your legal departments and so on. But from the other side, I'm going to be positive here, it allows us to refer to something. It allows us to know what the industry thinks. It allows us to know how we should behave in the correct way and how we can proceed and progress towards a more safe and sustainable future. Now, if we can do this right, and if we can get other domains on board, then actually there are positive impacts. And we have to consider numerous other aspects, such as how do we phase this, how do we integrate it into business decisions, and so on. But we have to really think of it from a holistic perspective that doesn't just include technical people or doesn't just include legal and regulatory, but includes every single person in your company, all companies, all space actors, and other industries too, the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these words, and definitely it adds a very interesting perspective. I will let Elina answer, and then James.
Thank you. I will just give you one example of space cyber domains to explain that I believe that such interrelation makes things more complicated. You well know that space law is quite well developed with the UN Space Treaty, soft law regulation, and national legislation. It is very much state-centric, and generally you will always find a responsible and liable state. And compare this with cyber domain with little or even no norms, mandatory norms, and only emerging recommendatory norms. And how would you regulate what is on the edge of these two domains? For instance, just last week I read a news item on the press that for the military needs, the private company is developing an on-orbit servicing technology, including robotic arm, which is using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And you can imagine this robotic arm to take some actions and to take decisions in space. And how would you regulate liability and responsibility in this case if you consider that what is applicable according to space law is not quite, I would say, fair in in this situation. So I'm more negative than positive, but of course there are always two metals, and if we have more stakeholders, perhaps we have more expertise and we have more examples of already existing norms which can help to regulate something on the edge. Thank you.
Absolutely, more complexity makes things harder. It means you've got more issues to consider. You've got more uncertainty, more ambiguity. You've got a larger number and diversity of actors involved, who all rightly should have a voice. But that then means a more time-consuming discussion, and it's harder to come to something that isn't a kind of very low common denominator position. I think on a more prosaic level, within kind of government institutions, either at the multinational or the national level, it's worth reminding ourselves that, not all domains are kind of born equal still. So as much as concepts like multi-domain operations that I briefly remarked on in my comments might talk about all of the domains as being equal, the reality is that still, space is the kind of number of people working on space in the military, for example, or in ministries of government that run the military is much smaller than the number of people working on air, maritime, land, and even cyber in most countries. So as a small workforce, kind of space literacy is variable across many of the institutions that are making policy at a national level, making regulations, and then obviously kind of imposing those on the private sector, and then engaging with other nations to come up with norms and international law. So I think really the key here is just the need for more education and awareness raising ultimately, and that's kind of at all levels. So education and awareness raising across nations, across politicians, across policymakers, the military, civilians, industry, and then of course the general public, and also civil society. And of course this isn't a quick fix, this takes time, but I'm a historian by background, which gives me few employable skills, but it does teach me that one of the lessons from history is that if we don't do preemptive education of the risks and threats we face, the only way people actually learn is after something really, really bad happens to them, and they turn around and say, well, nobody told me. And we would obviously rather avoid a situation where fast forward 5 or 10 years, there's been some catastrophic event in space or because of something in space, and we're all complaining that people hadn't raised the alarm earlier. So I think really that just underscores the need for the educational dimension of these sorts of conferences and discussions as well. So that is in and of itself a useful output, I think.
Thank you very much both for these answers. And Sabrina, you wanted to add some points on this?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief for all of you. So I just wanted to touch on one thing about space security or space sustainability. So it was rightly mentioned that you do have upcoming technologies that help solve the space, STM, on-orbit servicing, and so on. But why is it not in normal use today? And the reason being is that it's not commercially viable. Nothing has been completely proved. It's very expensive, and so commercial players don't put the money down right now because they can't. It's too big of a risk. You're looking at 100 million and around that mark. As a commercial player, you need to be able to do something that makes business sense. So I mentioned ESG today, and we want to do that. But right now there's a lack of funding for these startups. There's a lack of kind of collaboration within the industry to bring these commercial players together to make this viable. I know there are some projects here and there, but actually nothing yet has made these players stand up and say, look, we're going to adopt all of these technologies because we can. But right now they're exploring it, they want to do it, but we do need to find a way, whether it's regulation-based, whether it's incentive-based, that was mentioned earlier, to enable this, to really create this secure and safe space environment.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting that you mentioned these different points because, yes, about the business sense, this is something that is regularly reminded as being one of the priorities. But as we are discussing dependency and cooperation, it's one of the points, but it's the part of like a big picture for space activities, and this is definitely something that is great to bring into the discussion as we are discussing a normative framework and laws it really depends on national frameworks, national perspectives, and the priority for the business is one thing, and the priority with regards to space security as addressed by states and diplomats in multilateral fora is also very interesting and an important point. I can see that, Beyza, you raised your hand.
I was just going to add a point that James made on complexity. I worked on complexity issues for some time before joining the United Nations. So I completely agree with James on his points. I think the million-dollar question or the answer to this is really how to respond to complex problems. Because what we are facing today is a layer and level of complexity on different arms control issues that links with emerging technology areas. That is the reason why I think that cross-fertilization and integration of different domains makes the legal and normative frameworks quite harder to tackle. And in the long run, we're going to face that challenge even more. So we need to, I think, talk to the complexity theorists. We need to talk to the mathematicians. We should kind of expand the field outside of the general decision makers or the international organizations or NGO scope and bring in new blood, fresh blood in a way. If you look at complexity theory and wicked problems understanding, the way that they look at the issues, different issues, is that there is no one approach to a problem. So if you're looking at outer space issues, we need to understand that there is no one single approach, and that even the competing perspectives actually could lead us to multiple possible solutions. And accepting that, I think, would be really helpful for the states or for all stakeholders to come up with innovative ideas rather than being stuck to just one singular idea. Yeah, thanks, Letitia.
Thank you very much for these answers. And I can see that there are two questions from the room. Ben Silverstein, you have the floor.
I'll try to make this quick without speaking too fast. The INCSE, or the fascination with INCSE is interesting to me as they're mostly bilateral, if not regional, and space doesn't really allow us that geographical privilege where satellites are interacting with other satellites independent of region of origin. Do you see any risks that the format becomes fractured between partners in bilateral agreements like that? If so, what are your preferences on or opinions on the best ways to mitigate those risks?
Thank you very much. Mr. Froid, you have the floor.
Yeah, don't be afraid of complexity. I don't know how to explain walk, but I can walk. And so now I would like to say, there was a question about UN governance. I think that for discussion, for between countries, it's doing very well, but not for action. And so I was wondering if another model of an agency, okay, I worked for the European Space Agency, so intergovernmental, but we could connect every day technology, science, Earth observation, research, application, funding, industrial, academia, users, customers. So we did that all the time. And so we didn't have to handle all the possible connections. You know, if you have 100 partners, you have 5,000 connections. So you cannot handle that. You need to regroup that into topics of common interest where we will have action. So could we think of a global space security agency where we could put some of the resources to address some of the needs, education, training, research, technology, and legal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. They are not very easy questions, so it's a very great way to end this panel discussion. Eric, do you want to take the floor first? Thank you.
I think first to Ben's question about, is there a risk this becomes fractured? I think one of the good things about the space environment right now is that we have a process that it will hopefully bring us to a conclusion where we can get consensus on how to come up with a common understanding on this issue. And that's the open-ended working group on reducing space threats, where we have all countries have the option of participating. Now, not all have shown up, obviously, but we are not at a point where we already have an existing framework that could lead us to fragmentation, because some countries are going in one direction and other countries are going in a different direction. At least that's my hope. And then I guess I would say the United States is not ready to abandon the United Nations just yet. The creation of a new international body would require lots of money, and the United States, who provides 33% of funding for international bodies, is not really going to be interested.
What about a multilateral, like global space security agency? I mean, put it some
Right. So,
resources.
I mean, the United Nations is multilateral, and again, we provide 33% of that funding, but also it still falls upon the states for multiple reasons, right? The legal regime requires the states to be in charge of the launch, the licensing, the regulation of all of these activities, and so it is going to fall to the states to make those decisions, and right now the UN is the place to be making those decisions. Thanks.
Thank you for your answer. Elina, you're next.
Of course, any kind of a neutral platform, global platform with multi-stakeholders is very much important, but in the current situation, I lack confidence that it is possible to agree upon anything, including creating a new organization. For many years, there have been discussions to whom assign which functions related to space traffic monitoring, to some other questions, and doubts were expressed whether it could be done on the basis of UN corpors or even ITU. ITU exactly is always promoted as a very good example for how really states and industry players and academia are interrelated in moving towards a common understanding and solutions. As in your examples, there are also sector members which give together about 20,000 experts working together on a very good solution, and this example can be fruitful. And also I would refer to Eric when you speak about international organizations which are also lacking some trust these days. Funding is important, and always you also look at who funds what. This is also applicable to the ITU and to UN corpors, and it is clear from official data which states support which projects and so on and so forth. And it also raises some questions, but to be comprehensive on this topic and to refer to the previous panel, I completely agree with Jessica West that during last years the role and the voice of every state is becoming more and more important. I mean, including emerging space nations and developing countries, and it is something which is also important, irrelevant who funds what. So this would be my answer.
Thank you very much for this answer. And indeed, the funding in general is a very important question, because the capacity building, for instance, also depends on this. Beyza, do you want to answer next?
Yes. Thank you, Eric, for indicating the continuous support. The question was also made me thinking about what would that look like, what would that agency look like, what would the work look like, and also whether the states would even support that. The reason why I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel in here is that we have the necessary tools within the United Nations, within the First Committee. And those tools are there for states to use it. We can go with the norms approach, the norms, rules, principles. We could go with the legally binding measures. We could look at TCBMs. There are many alternatives that states can use and work together. The issue is not about the United Nations or whether the United Nations mechanisms work or not. The issue and the challenge in here is that the states need to come together and negotiate agreements or come up with ideas on responsible behaviors, and then to take that forward and implement what is agreed. The UN Charter and the international law, IHL, applies to outer space, and states have indicated that for many times. during the OEWG discussions. So, you know, we are not at a stage of leaving everything and starting from completely new or reinventing the wheel. I think that would be quite unconstructive, I think. Also, the other thing that we need to realize is that not everything within the first committee is stuck. The OEWG and ICT security actually has agreed on an annual progress report on a consensus basis in July. In July of this year, you know, when the security environment has deteriorated already. So we are seeing, at least within the Secretariat, that there are venues for states to explore ideas and come together and negotiate. And I think outer space is one of those areas that states are continuously engaging, and hopefully we will come up with better solutions that would be in a form of norms, rules, and principles, perhaps also leading to the legally binding measures. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is James, the one with the final word.
I did say I'd stand between you and the drinks. So I'll make my remarks no longer than 45 minutes. They'll feel like 45 minutes, don't worry. I think there's an interlinkage between those two questions, which is fitting in a discussion of interlinkages. I think the point, Ben, about the challenges that maritime, a lot of these agreements are bilateral, whereas we are going for a more kind of global multilateral solution on space. I think it is an observation well made. I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive, though. Of course, we can have a kind of common level of acceptable norms or legally binding instruments, depending on which way states end up going, which define probably a low to moderate level of ambition, because it's harder to get agreement amongst 200 countries than amongst 2 countries. And then you can have subsets of countries that want to go beyond that and be more ambitious and say, we're going to hold ourselves to a slightly higher standard, and we're actually going to do it, not that we're legally or normatively required by the global community, but we're going to do it because that's our values. And either nationally or as a club of nations, we're going to do that. And that, of course, is a way of kind of stretching the level of ambition of everybody else and leading by moral example and trying to impose kind of social and political pressures on other countries to raise their own level of ambition. And we've seen similar things with issues like climate, right, where certain countries are willing to say, we're going to push harder, but we want to do so that we can then have leverage to encourage others to come with us in future. So I don't think the kind of minilateral and multilateral solutions are necessarily at odds with each other. It's just making sure that we don't end up in a situation where the multilateral is so kind of lowest common denominator that it's not achieving anything, and it's all reliant on the bilateral and minilateral, which then becomes very reliant on individual states' willingness to do things, which other states aren't always going to trust. Which I think links to the second point then about which Beyza kind of rightly described. A lot of the issue with the complexity is not the kind of multilateral institutions per se, but it's the question of getting the will of nations to agree on things, particularly in a fractious security environment. I think certainly it is clear in my mind that the kind of multilateral setup we have now will not be the multilateral setup we have in 100 years' time, just because inevitably institutions evolve, and we are now dealing with a period where, with issues like climate, but also a lot of emerging technology, AI, space, cyber, we have complex non-linear problems where things grow exponentially, but we have institutions that act in a linear manner because that's how they were designed. So we're not necessarily configured to deal with a world where the number of space objects is not growing. It's not kind of going the same rate each year. It's going up exponentially, as are the complexity of the kind of security challenges. So I do think we will see longer term change, but I have no idea what that would mean in the short term, and I certainly couldn't prescribe a solution. But a final remark would be that whilst we're waiting for that golden solution, the best thing I think really is something we've discussed earlier, which is inclusivity of different perspectives in the debate. So that's the best way within the kind of current structures that we have of ensuring cross-pollination of ideas and concerns between the first and fourth committee, but also the inputs of different national perspectives, civil society's perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things ultimately contribute to addressing what is a kind of wicked problem and a social mess within the constraint of a kind of inherently state-based and linear-focused set of international structures.
So now that we are wrapping up these discussions, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for their thought-provoking insights. It has been, as I said, fascinating to hear about your respective perspectives, and I hope that this is just the beginning of the discussions. We also have seen that with this interconnection, this notion I mentioned in my introduction, with interconnection, interactions are crucial. And this is interactions plural because they come from different stakeholders over time. And it cannot be a discussion crystallized at a specific singular time, but an ongoing exchange of perspectives and ideas that may lead to concrete actions. So as I say, this is just the beginning, also because we will have discussions tomorrow. Thank you very much all for your active engagement today.
Thank you so much. So James thought he was going to be the one standing in between you and the drinks, but it's going to be me. Very briefly to thank all of the panelists and all of the moderators. Thank you for your great work, for your great insights. Also thank you to all of the attendees, both those of you that are here in person and those of you that have joined us from all over the world virtually. And we also hope to see all of you both here in person and virtually tomorrow to continue this important topic.